The photograph is only a fraction of a single afternoon. 6 men, a length of Japanese pipe, a flag catching the wind on the summit of a dead volcano. That image would become the most reproduced photograph in American history. It was pressed onto postage stamps, onto war bond posters, cast in bronze 32 feet high on a hill outside Washington. It told a grieving nation that the sacrifice had meaning, that the cost had been paid for something real. But look closely at what the photograph actually shows. It shows a flag going up. It does not show why the island beneath it had to be taken at all. It does not show the argument, still unsettled in the highest rooms of the American command, over whether this speck of volcanic ash was worth a single American life. Nearly 7,000 Americans died taking this island. For the better part of a century, we have been told they died so that tens of thousands of airmen could live. It is one of the most repeated justifications of the entire Pacific War. And when you go down into the archive, into the flight logs, the planning memos, the private doubts of the admirals who ran the campaign, that justification begins to come apart in your hands. This is the story of Iwo Jima, not the flag, the island underneath it, and the uncomfortable possibility that the most famous photograph in America is not a monument to a victory, but an alibi for its cost. By the winter of 1945, the American advance across the Pacific had a name: island hopping. Rather than bleed for every island Japan held, American forces seized only the ones that mattered, the ones with airfields and harbors, the stepping stones toward Japan itself, and left the rest to wither behind the front. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific, had ridden this strategy from island to island, closer and closer to Tokyo. The Marianas, Saipan and Tinian and Guam had given America the bomber bases it needed. From their runways, the enormous B-29 superfortresses were now flying north to burn Japanese cities to the ground. But the flight was 1,500 miles each way, hours over open ocean with no place to come down, and it passed directly over a small volcanic island the Japanese had fortified, garrisoned, and used to radio warnings ahead of every raid. The island was a thorn in the bombing campaign. It was also, from the American point of view, a problem with an obvious answer: take it. That island was Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of black rock and sulfur, part of the Bone-In Islands, which the Japanese call Ogasawara. Its larger neighbor, Chichi-Jima, was bypassed. Iwo Jima was not. It had airfields. It sat almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese mainland. On a map, it looked like the perfect next stepping stone. And a map is a dangerous thing to fall in love with. Because behind the closed doors of the American command, there was no agreement that the island was worth the price of taking it. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, was openly skeptical. A captured Iwo Jima, he warned, could become a sinkhole, a place that swallowed men and resources and gave little back. As a staging base for the coming invasion of Japan, the island was close to useless. Too small, no safe anchorage, and farther from the target than better options. What tipped the decision was air power. General Henry Arnold of the Army Air Forces wanted the island's airfields to base fighter escorts, fighters that could ride along on the long B-29 raids and protect the bombers over Japan. That was the argument that carried the day. Take the island, base the fighters, shield the bombers. It sounded clean, and it sounded worth it. The Marines who would pay for that decision were never in the room where it was made. And while the admirals weighed the island's worth from a continent away, a Japanese general was already standing on its black sand, deciding exactly how unbearable he could make the cost. He did not believe he could win. He intended instead to make the price a wound America would never forget. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi. As a younger officer, he had traveled and studied in the United States, and he had watched American factories with his own eyes. He held few illusions about Japan's ability to outproduce the country he was now sworn to fight. When he took command of Iwo Jima's defense, He did something that broke sharply with everything Japanese doctrine had taught. For most of the Pacific War, Japanese defenders had answered invasion with the banzai charge, a massed, headlong rush, often suicidal, that spent hundreds of lives quickly for a chance at breaking the enemy line. On Saipan, such charges had ended in massacre. Kuribayashi forbade them. He would not let his men throw their lives away in a single doomed morning. He wanted them to die slowly from cover and to take as many Americans with them as each man could. So he moved the battle inside the island. His soldiers dug a network of tunnels down into the soft volcanic rock, miles of passages linking bunkers, gun rooms, command posts, and hospitals, all of it hidden from the sky. The Americans would not fight an army standing on the ground. They would have to dig it out of the ground, position by position, cave by cave. The island itself would be the weapon. And the island was a strange and hostile place to fight in. Iwo Jima means, roughly, Sulphur Island. The volcanic rock underfoot was warm, in places hot. Sulfur steam leaked from cracks in the ground, and the whole place carried a smell of rotten eggs. Kuribayashi's men lived and died in tunnels where the air was foul and the walls were warm to the touch, waiting in the dark for footsteps overhead. It was, by the account of nearly everyone who survived it, the closest thing to hell that men in that war had a word for. He gave his men a set of orders he called the courageous battle vows. Each defender was to make his fighting position his grave. Each was to kill 10 Americans before he himself fell. There would be no surrender. There would be no rescue. There would only be the rock and the waiting. On the 19th of February, 1945, the Marines came ashore. For a few minutes the black beach was almost quiet, and then Kuribayashi's hidden guns opened from the high ground, and the volcanic sand became a killing field. Men could not dig into the loose ash for cover. They could not see an enemy who fired from inside the island and vanished back into it. What was meant to be a battle of a few days became a battle of 5 brutal weeks. The Marines gave the worst places names that said everything. The Meat Grinder, where some 850 of them died taking a single stronghold. The Bloody Gorge, where the last defenders made their stand. Iwo Jima became the only major battle of the entire Pacific War in which American casualties outnumbered the Japanese dead. 27 medals of honor would be awarded for those weeks, more than for any other battle in American history. And on the 5th day of that fight, on a mountain that was supposed to have fallen in hours, a small patrol clawed its way to the summit and raised a flag. Then, a few hours later, they raised a second one. The mountain was Suribachi, a dead volcano at the island's southern tip, 550 feet high. Whoever held it could see the whole island and pour fire down onto the beaches. Taking it mattered more than any other single objective. And on the morning of the 23rd of February, a patrol fought its way to the top and raised a small American flag on a length of captured Japanese water pipe. The men on the beaches below saw it and roared. A marine photographer named WWII captured that first flag, but it was small, hard to make out from the shoreline where men were still falling. So a few hours later, a second, far larger flag was carried up to replace it, big enough to be seen across the whole island. An Associated Press photographer named Joe Rosenthal was still climbing when it happened, and he nearly missed it. He threw up his camera as the second flag rose and pressed the shutter without even looking through the viewfinder. A step away from him, a Marine sergeant named Bill Gunost was filming the very same moment on motion picture film. Neither man knew he had just recorded the most famous image of the war. That photograph, the second flag, became the most reproduced image in human history. And almost at once, a rumor chased it, that Rosenthal had staged the shot, posed his men for the camera. He would spend the rest of his life denying it, and he was telling the truth. Gunost's film, taken from a single step away, shows the same bodies, the same motion, the same unposed instant. The camera cleared the photographer. The photograph moved with a speed that still seems impossible. It was flown to Guam, developed, put on the wire, and within about 17 hours of the shutter clicking, it was running on front pages across the United States and lying on the desk of President Roosevelt. It won the Pulitzer Prize that same year, the only time the prize has gone to a photograph taken in the year it was awarded. Overnight, a picture almost nobody on the island had noticed being taken became the face of the entire war. But there is a deeper irony buried in that frame, one that took 70 years to fully surface. For decades, the military could not even name the men in it correctly. The official record of who raised that flag was wrong, and it had to be corrected not once but twice, in 2016 and again in 2019, after amateur historians forced the Marine Corps to admit its identifications had been mistaken. The most famous photograph in America, and for 2/3 of a century, we did not know for certain who was in it. 3 of the men in that frame would be dead before the island was declared secure, but the photograph would outlive every one of them, and soon it would be asked to do something far heavier than honor the dead. It would be used to prove that the island had been worth taking. Consider what happened to the men in that frame. 3 of the 6 were killed in the weeks of fighting that followed, before the island was even secured. They never knew the photograph existed. The 3 who lived were pulled off the battlefield and sent home to become the living faces of a war bond tour, paraded through stadiums and banquet halls to sell the war to the people paying for it. One of them was Ira Hayes, a Pima man from Arizona. He had climbed that mountain with his friends, watched some of them die, and was now asked to stand on stages and point to himself in a picture. He never made peace with it. He would say that the real heroes were the men who did not come back. He drank and he struggled, and he died young on cold ground a decade after the flag went up. The photograph made him immortal, and it did not save him at all. This is the first crack in the image. The men in it were not symbols. They were exhausted young men, most of them barely out of boyhood, and the picture asked them to carry a meaning far heavier than the flag itself. A nation looked at those 6 figures and saw resolve, unity, victory. The men themselves, the ones who lived, mostly saw the friends who were no longer standing beside them. The gap between what the country needed the image to mean and what it actually cost the men inside it is the whole story of Iwo Jima in miniature. The battle was declared over on the 26th of March, 1945. The cost is still hard to take in. 6,821 Americans were killed. Almost 19,000 more were wounded. Of the roughly 20,000 Japanese defenders, only about 1,000 were left alive to be taken prisoner. Kuribayashi's design had worked exactly as he meant it to. He had made the price of his island very nearly unbearable. And almost the moment it ended, the questions began. Had it been worth it? The fighter escort mission, the entire reason General Arnold had wanted the island, quietly failed. Escorting B-29s all the way from Iwo Jima proved unproductive, and in the end, unnecessary. The single rationale that had carried the decision simply did not deliver what had been promised. So a new justification appeared to take its place. It said that the island's airfields had saved the lives of B-29 crews who made emergency landings there, bombers too shot up or too low on fuel to reach the Marianas. The number that came to carry this claim was enormous, more than 2,000 landings, more than 20,000 airmen brought safely down. One airman saved, the story went, for nearly every Marine who had fallen. It was a clean, comforting piece of arithmetic. One life given, one life saved. And it became the standard answer to anyone who dared ask whether the island had been worth its terrible cost. Decades later, a Marine officer and historian named Robert Burrell went into the archive to test that number against the record. What he found took it apart. The figure had been built by counting every single B-29 that ever touched down on Iwo Jima as an emergency landing that saved a doomed crew. But most of those landings were nothing of the kind. Of the roughly 2,000 landings made in the summer of 1945, more than 80% were routine. Refueling stops, training flights, ordinary traffic passing through. The picture of thousands of crippled bombers limping to safety on that runway was, in large part, a statistic assembled after the fact to justify a battle that had already been fought and paid for. The justification, in other words, came after the blood, not before it. The number that reassured a nation for generations was not the reason the men had been sent. It was the reason invented once they were already gone. But if the strategic case was really so thin, why did the myth of Iwo Jima grow so vast? Because the country needed it too. The photograph arrived at the exact moment America was exhausted and the war was not yet won. It was made the centerpiece of a war bond drive that raised billions of dollars. It was carved into a bronze memorial 78 feet high, dedicated outside Washington in 1954. It became a postage stamp, a recruiting image, the very emblem of the Marine Corps, an institution that after the war was fighting for its own survival against those who wanted to dissolve it into the other services. The image born on Kuribayashi helped save the Corps as an idea. That is not a small thing, and it is not a cynical one. Nations run on symbols as much as on strategy, and a country fighting a war it has not yet won needs somewhere to put its faith. Iwo Jima gave it one. The tragedy is only in what came after, when a picture that honored the dead was quietly turned into an argument that their deaths had been necessary, and the two things were allowed to blur into one. So the dead of Iwo Jima did give their country something real, just not, for the most part, the thing we were told they gave. They did not save 24,000 airmen on that runway. They gave America a picture it desperately needed to believe in, and that picture went on to do real work in real history for decades after the last gun on the island fell silent. So, was it worth it? Here is the strongest case that it was, and it deserves to be heard without flinching. At the start of 1945, no one in the American command had the archive we have now. They were staring straight at the invasion of Japan itself, an operation nearly everyone believed would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Seen from there, seizing a fortified island directly beneath the B-29 flight path, an island the enemy had turned into a fortress, looked like prudence, not folly. The fighter escort rationale failed, but no one could have known that going in. There is also a quieter argument, harder to measure, that the ferocity of Iwo Jima and of Okinawa after it fed directly into the most consequential decision of the war. The closer the Americans got to Japan, the more certain they became that an invasion of the home islands would be a bloodbath without end, and that certainty shaped the choice to reach instead for the atomic bomb. Iwo Jima was one of the islands that taught that lesson in blood, and even the historian who dismantled the airfield myth grants that the image born on that island became a genuine symbol, one that helped fund the war and outlived everyone who fought there. By that measure, the men did not die for nothing. I take that seriously, and I still believe the honest verdict is harder than either of the comfortable ones, because the comfortable answers are two. One says Iwo Jima was a heroic necessity and the flag proves it. The other says it was a pointless slaughter and the numbers prove it. The archive supports neither cleanly. On the strategic ledger, the same ledger the planners themselves kept, the island did not repay its cost, and men like Admiral King suspected as much before a single Marine set foot on the sand. But the myth that grew from it was not a lie conjured out of nothing. It was real. It steadied a nation. It saved an institution. It became one of the truest symbols a country ever gave itself. That is the uncomfortable truth of Iwo Jima. The battle was probably not worth its cost, and the meaning we built from it was genuine all the same. And the men on that beach did not choose the strategy. They never sat with King and Arnold. They were handed an island and told to take it, and they took it, and nearly 7,000 of them never left. Whatever the archive says about the decision, it says nothing against them. That line between the soldiers and the system that spent them is the one the myth has always blurred, and the one we owe them the honesty to hold clear. One man in this story carries both halves of it at once. Bill Gunn-Ost, the Marine sergeant, stood a single step from Rosenthal and filmed the flag going up. His footage is the reason we know the most famous photograph of the war was real and never staged. He never saw it become an icon. 9 days after he filmed that flag, Gunn-Ost was killed in the fighting, somewhere in the dark of one of Kuribayashi's caves. His body was never recovered. It is still there, inside the island. The camera outlived the man. The image outlived the truth about the island. And the 6 men who raised that flag remain, in the end, more honest than everything we chose to make of them.